So let's look at passive transport mechanisms. One would be simple diffusion across a membrane. So diffusion is the movement of molecules or substances that are spreading out evenly into space. So for example, here we see this yellow line indicates a membrane, and it's semi-permeable, meaning certain things can get across, like these little red molecules. And since they are initially in a higher concentration here on the left, they will naturally move to an area where they are in lower concentration initially. And that's referred to as diffusion. And that will continue to occur. Diffusion will continue to occur until there's no more concentration gradient, meaning everything's evenly distributed. The situation is at equilibrium. There's still movement. Some might move to the left, some might move to the right. They're bouncing around, but overall they are evenly distributed. There's an equal concentration on both sides. The situation's at equilibrium, even though there is still movement. Okay? So diffusion is going to occur whenever there's a concentration gradient. Okay? Meaning, here on the left, there's a higher concentration of the substance on the left versus on the right. And because there's a concentration gradient, the substances will move from an area of high concentration initially to an area of low concentration initially. And that will continue until there's no concentration gradient. Everything's evenly distributed. We say that's at equilibrium again. They can still move around. A little can move to the left, a little can move to the right, but overall, diffusion has stopped because there's no more concentration gradient here on the far right. Okay? So this is a passive transport mechanism. Diffusion of a substance across a membrane with no energy input required. What's pushing the substances across is the concentration gradient. Okay, so substances will diffuse down their concentration gradient from high to low. And you have natural experience with this. If you think of, I don't know, somebody coming into the classroom with a lot of cologne or perfume on, and they sit down in the classroom, you eventually will smell that because the perfume or cologne is highly concentrated on the person's skin or clothing, and it will diffuse through the air until it reaches your nostrils and you smell it. Over enough amount of time, that perfume or cologne will be evenly distributed in the classroom. So a little video here on diffusion.
Diffusion is the tendency for particles of any kind to spread out from where they are more concentrated to where they are less concentrated. This process can also be described as molecules moving down their concentration gradient. Diffusion across a biological membrane is called passive transport, since the cell expends no energy to move the molecules. Oxygen and carbon dioxide molecules move into and out of cells by passive transport.
Okay. So again, substances can simply diffuse across a membrane if they can get across. So substances that cannot cross membranes, things that are hydrophilic or large substances, and hydrophilic things or things like ions cannot get across easily because they're hydrophilic. If we remember the makeup of the phospholipid bilayer of a membrane, most of it is the fatty acid tails, which are hydrophobic. The phosphate groups are hydrophilic, so most of the membrane is hydrophobic. So things that are hydrophobic in nature, or like lipids, they can tend to get across quite easily. Hydrophilic substances cannot get across easily. Facilitated diffusion is another type of passive transport across the membrane where the cell produces and places a protein in the membrane that acts as a channel for particular substances to get across the membrane that can't get across the membrane on their own. And in this example, what's pushing these substances, like say glucose, into the cell, there's no energy pushing them into the cell, it's just the concentration gradient. these molecules are going down their concentration gradient through a membrane protein that is acting as a channel that's allowing them to go down their concentration gradient, diffuse into the cell. And since the protein is facilitating this process, it's called facilitated diffusion. All right, so a little bit on osmosis and water balance. So again, osmosis, diffusion of water across the membrane. It's a type of passive transport. The reason being is because these are cells. Water can get across the membrane quite easily. And when water diffuses across the membrane, it's called osmosis. So a solution is a mixture of a solute, something that's dissolved, into a solvent. And biologically speaking, the solvent's always going to be water. The solute is something like, say, sodium chloride salt. Okay, so a solution is a mixture of a solute that's dissolved into a solvent. So at the cellular level, the little blue spheres here are water molecules. The red ones are solutes, like salt. So if there's a higher concentration of solutes outside the cell, and if those solutes cannot get across the membrane because they're, say, hydrophilic, that means that the water can diffuse across the membrane, and it will. So this will draw water out of the cell, and that movement of the water across the biological membrane here is osmosis. This little setup is showing you just a theoretical setup with water and a biological selectively permeable type membrane in the middle. And if you increase the solute concentration on one side, the water and those substances cannot get across the membrane. The water will, it's much smaller. So in this case, the water is going to go from the left into the right. The water is going down its concentration gradient is literally what's happening. And that's diffusion. With water moving across the membrane, and since it's water, we call this type of diffusion osmosis. So the cell cytosol, the solution inside a cell, has many solutes, salts and glucose, etc., and that's what helps maintain water balance. The amount of water leaving or exiting a cell tends to be balanced because there's solutes outside and there's solutes inside of cells. Okay, quick little video here on osmosis.
The plasma membrane is permeable to water molecules, and the movement of water into and out of cells is critical to life. Diffusion of water molecules across a selectively permeable membrane is a special kind of passive transport called osmosis.
All right. So compared to another solution or a cell, meaning a hypertonic solution when compared to another solution or to a cell. So think of a solution outside of a cell, okay? That solution is hypertonic, or the environment outside of a cell. That solution or environment is hypertonic if that solution has a higher concentration of solutes. So in the example here on the left, if this is the theoretical cell or a particular environment, we would say compared to that cell, what we have on the right is a hypertonic environment or solution. It's a solution that has a higher concentration of solutes relative to what's here on the left or to a theoretical cell. Okay? Think of hyper as being elevated. Like you give a kid sugar, they're going to be hyper, right? Higher concentration of solutes relative to something, usually a cell. The opposite, hypotonic solution, has a lower concentration of solute. Let's go back to this environment again. If we're comparing the left side to the right side, the left side has a lower solute concentration, so it's considered to be hypotonic to what's on the right. And then isotonic, the solutions or the cell has the same concentration as what's outside or the environment. So if we look over here on the right, even though the water levels are different, the overall concentration of solutes on both sides is the same, equivalent. So that's a situation where the solutions are isotonic. If this is a cell on the left and on the right is the external environment, and if the solute concentrations are the same, we would say that that environment is isotonic relative to the cell. So this has an impact on organisms at the tissue and cellular level. So if you consider a fish in a freshwater environment, the surrounding solution is hypotonic, has a low concentration of solutes relative to the cells and the tissues of the fish. That means that the fish's cells and tissues have a higher solute concentration than the outside environment. That is also saying that the outside external environment has a higher water concentration relative to inside of the fish. So in this type of environment, in freshwater environments, organisms like fish that live in fresh water are always having to deal with water flowing into the fish's cells and tissues via osmosis. This is like the situation we have here on the left. This is the cells of the fish. The fish in fresh water is living in a situation with lower solute concentrations relative to the fish. Hypotonic external environment. Remember, hypo means less than. Lower solute concentrations externally. That means water is going to be driven into the cells and tissues of the fish via osmosis. So freshwater animals, fish, even amoeba, protists, have to have ways of dealing with that. And what freshwater fish do is they urinate, they pee constantly, very dilute urine, to get rid of the excess water that's constantly moving into their cells and tissues. So water balance is essential for the health of cells, organisms, tissues, organisms themselves, plants and or animals. Okay? So the survival of these things depends on the ability to regulate and balance water uptake, intake, and water loss. So osmoregulation is the control of water balance in organisms. Osmo for water, regulation for control of the water concentration. So plant cells have external rigid cell walls, which helps them deal with some of the issues with water balance. Animal cells do not. This is a red blood cell, just a typical plant cell there on the bottom. So plant cells are actually healthiest under hypotonic environments, and that's when water would enter into a cell. And again, hypotonic, meaning externally lower solute concentration, but also higher water concentration relative to the cell. The solutes, most of them can't get across the plasma membrane easily, but water can. So in this case, the water will go down its concentration via osmosis and enter into the cell. What that causes is the cell to swell up with the excess water, but since plant cells have a nice tough cell wall, it prevents them from bursting, and it makes the cells and the tissues of the plant turgid, rigid, and plants stand erect and they're healthy. Contrast that to an animal cell. We do not have cell walls, so excess water entering into our cells can cause them to burst or to lyse, and that's not good. Animal cells are happiest in the sense of healthy under isotonic environments or solutions. That means the external environment has a similar solute concentration versus our cells and tissues, which means a similar water concentration, inside versus outside. That means small amount of water that enters matches the small amount of water that exits. The cell is normal, functioning well. In a plant cell, however, that causes the cells to be a bit flaccid, and the plant will tend to wilt somewhat. That's like when your plants at home tell you, hey, I'm wilting a little bit, I need to be watered. Yeah? Continuing this, let's look at a nice healthy plant cell here. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, looks like about 6 cells here. Thick cell wall, that's all that's really visible besides the green chloroplast inside. Notice how they're moving. That's the normal healthy environment for plant cells. They're moving within the watery cytosol. and that's normal. This is indicating nice